Hello and welcome to my boss guide for Seath the Scaleless. One thing that's very important before you actually start the fight is that this boss has some attacks that can inflict the curse condition on you. And curse is very nasty, so make sure you have some curse resistance if you're uncertain about being able to dodge all of his attacks. The first and easiest way to increase your curse resistance is to simply increase your soft humanity, which is the stat right there in the top left corner of the screen, by consuming humanities. This will increase your curse resistance by quite a bit for the first few points, and then there's some diminishing returns, but having 5 or so soft humanity is definitely worthwhile. In addition, if your build permits you to change your armor set, there's quite a few that have decent curse resistance. I'm going to limit myself here to the ones I've actually shown you in the walkthrough. So there is the Antiquated set, which you find in a corpse in Darkroot Basin after freeing Dusk from the Golden Golem. This is definitely the highest curse resistance on this list, but its resistances against other types of damage are pretty meager. There is the Crimson set, which you can find in Blighttown. There is the Dingy set, which you receive from the corpse of the Firekeeper at Firelink Shrine once Lordshek has murdered her. And there's Havel's set, which is one of the heaviest sets in the game, but also has decent curse resistance. And finally, there is the Armor of Favor, which you can get after you've killed Lordshek and you've beaten Ornstein and Smough. It's on a corpse right after that boss fight. The main issue with being cursed is that it cuts your maximum HP in half, which is obviously a massive handicap. And removing curse is somewhat difficult because it doesn't get removed after you die. It's there until you actually fix it. Now, conveniently enough, the enemies right before the boss fight here have the ability to drop Purging Stones, which can remove curse. So that is somewhat nice, but it would obviously be preferable if you didn't have to farm those. And then secondly, a somewhat less important point, if you can avoid it, don't focus on a magic weapon for this fight. Seath, being associated with magic, has a massive amount of magic resistance. Elemental weapons that are lightning or fire based work very well, he's quite weak to those, and standard physical attacks are also decently strong. However, if your main damage is magic based, you will not be dealing very much to this particular boss. Lightning weapons in particular, which can be made with the giant blacksmith in Anor Londo, are quite handy to have. Basically all throughout the base game, outside of the DLC, because they have decent damage without requiring a massive stat investment. So for many builds, a lightning weapon is a nice thing to have, and against Seath in particular, he's quite weak to lightning. And finally, there is a group of man-eater clams right in front of the boss fight. And only the first time around there is no fog gate, which means they can follow you into the boss fight and you will have to deal with those clams at the same time as the boss. The boss's attacks do eventually kill them, but they might kill you first. So, only for the first time, when there isn't a fog gate, you should kill these clams just to be safe, because then they can't follow you. When watching the cutscene, you will notice this crystal features prominently. And if you've been following the questline of Big Head Logan, you will also know why. This is what makes Seath immortal, which is why you couldn't kill him on the first encounter, and you also can't kill him on this encounter as long as this crystal is intact. Now, you might want to just destroy it instantly and start fighting, but you can actually use the crystal a little more creatively. Because when it is broken, Seath will be staggered for around 10 seconds. And that can be a good opportunity to get some free hits in without having to worry about what Seath does. And in order to best use this opportunity, you should stand behind the crystal when the fight starts and let Seath come towards you. And only when he's quite close and starts winding up an attack should you destroy the crystal, because then you don't have to run very far and you can use almost the entirety of that stun duration to actually deal damage to the boss. Especially when you have a good option to deal burst damage to the boss, it might be that this is enough to kill him outright and you don't even have to worry about any of his attacks because this 10-second window is enough for you. You should also note that the central part of his body, this section, takes 50% more damage from all sources. And this just happens to also be the closest thing to you if you use the aforementioned strategy. So get in there and just swing away for at least a full stamina bar, maybe longer. And you will be able to deal a ton of damage to the boss without him being able to retaliate. If the boss is still alive after this, a normal fight begins. By this I mean you should bait out an attack by standing a little bit away from him, so don't be right up in his face. And then while his attack is basically brewing somewhere behind you, you can again get in on his central body and do damage to it. You might want to stay there if you notice the attack he's now charging up afterwards will not hit you there, but if you're uncertain about that, basically get a few swings in and then just run away. This is definitely the slowest but also the safest approach, because having to read his attacks, especially with the camera being the way it is, can be somewhat tricky. And when employing the slow strategy, it's important to not run in before he's actually started winding up an attack. Once he's starting, he can't stop, he doesn't interrupt his attacks, he's then set in on a certain direction and angle. So basically if he's targeting you at a certain distance and you run much closer, he won't hit you. But if you run in closer before he starts, then he also has attacks that can hit right in front of him. Something to be aware of. Now none of this should have been very troubling for you, so if your only goal is killing the boss, this is actually quite an easy one. Despite being very important to the story of the game, the encounter itself is quite simple and quite basic and shouldn't give you much trouble. What might give you trouble is if you want to cut his tail. The main issue is that Seath really doesn't like it when you get behind him. In front of him there isn't that much he can do and it's quite easy to avoid his attacks, but behind him he has a tailed slam, and he does slam it repeatedly in sort of random directions. It can be quite difficult to dodge this attack and it does a lot of damage. Also, while his general movement speed is quite slow, he is able to spin around his own axis very quickly. So if you're behind him and just about ready to attack his tail, he could just spin around and you won't be able to get an attack in. So again, there's a very simple trick you can do to possibly make this quite easy on yourself, and that is again employing the stagger he gets when you destroy the crystal. To do this you basically do the exact same thing I told you before, but instead of breaking the crystal when Seath is close to you, you actually just stand there and wait until he starts winding up an attack on you. Then you run around behind him. Usually around the time you're to his side, he will have finished his attack and broken the crystal himself. And that means that 10-second stagger window starts later. It also means that he's possibly used an attack that would make it difficult to get right in front of him, where you would want to go if you were just wanting to deal damage. But if you're trying to get behind him to his tail, this is the better way to do it. And also quite similar to the method you want to use for dealing damage, this is where you want your burst damage to occur. If you have some temporary buff or some very powerful spells that you don't have many casts of, this is probably where you want to use them. The rest of the fight might be a little slower that way, but this is one of the best opportunities to get a tail attack in. Also keep in mind that only the middle tail actually counts as being the tail cut, and you have to hit quite towards the end of it. Hitting right at the base doesn't deal damage to the tail, so you don't get the tail cut if you only damage him right here. If you didn't get enough damage in on this first opportunity, then it's really just a game of patience. You do almost the same thing as if you were just wanting to damage the boss. You stand in front of him and wait for him to start charging up an attack, and then you run around him quickly in order to try and get in on the tail. But because you need much more of an opening for that, it doesn't always work. Sometimes he's finished his attack and you haven't quite managed to get around him yet, and he will just spin and be facing you again. Or he might start winding up his tail slam, during which I wouldn't recommend trying to get damage in on the tail, because it is quite a dangerous attack. This is commonly considered the second hardest tail cut in the game. The only harder one would be one of the DLC bosses, and I would say everyone's agreed on that. So don't expect to get this on the first try. You may have to try a few times to get the timing right and get a strategy that works for you. Either way, eventually you will have the boss defeated, and as a reward you will receive 60,000 souls, a single humanity, and a bequeathed Lord Soul shard. This is an item you can't consume in any way. It is used to fill a Lord Vessel along with the 3 other Great Souls, which eventually opens up the final area and the final boss of the game. I hope you found some of the information in this video helpful. As always, I would appreciate any feedback you have, and I wish you a good day. Bye bye.